Okay, budget day was yesterday. Here is the budget analysis that you have been waiting for. Number one, non-sufficient funds penalties are going to be capped at $10. No more $35 fees. That seems like something that should be in the headlines. That seems like something that everybody should be aware of, because that's a pretty great change that honestly should have never happened and should have been capped ages ago. Anyway, this is not what I'm going to be talking about today. You probably saw that the federal budget came down yesterday, and the headlines was not sufficient funds penalties going to be capped at $10, but that they are taxing the rich to fund Canada. And the Liberals are so good at putting out these kinds of messages as if there's some sort of like working class champion, but also really great managers of the economy, whatever. Now, the tax increases that are going to be levied on rich people, like they're going to be levied on the smallest number of the most rich people in Canada. Okay. I saw one person on Twitter say that it's about 40,000 people who will have to pay more money because of this new capital gains tax increase. Inclusion is what it's called. Capital gains inclusion. So what is that? What is capital gains? It's like I say NSF for a bank, and you know exactly what that is because you're an average person. Capital gains. Sorry, I have some chia in my teeth. Capital gains are money that you get off of your investments, so like stocks or offloading a property or whatever. And right now in Canada, you are not taxed at all on your capital gains if they are under $250,000. So this is a way that Canada really makes sure that we exacerbate wealth inequality, right? So you're a poor person, you go over the amount of money you have in your bank account, you have to pay $35. You're a wealthy person, you're making $250,000 in capital gains. That's not your salary, right? You're also a rich, probably motherfucker making tons of money. You're not taxed at all until it hits $250,000, and then you're taxed at 50% for the money over and above that. Now, the capital gains inclusion is being increased to be 2/3, and the way that journalists are talking about it is as if this is like some sort of revolutionary, oh my God, the rich are going to be taxed in Canada. Not really at all true, and really this is not something that's been in place for all that long. There was actually periods of time where all of this stuff was taxed, but as I will mention a couple of times in this video, this budget is a really good example of that balance being completely out of whack between people who are extraordinarily rich in this country and everybody else. I did see something like the capital gains inclusion or exclusion impacts like the 0.01% top earners in Canada. It's like, why don't we just expropriate all their stuff and give it to everybody? Maybe we can do that. Anyway, whatever. Okay, so that was the headline, indicating, of course, that that journalists in this country think that the most important news is the news that impacts the smallest number of fucking people in this country. But behind that, the second big piece of news was the housing promise. Now, housing does get a really huge treatment in this budget, and there are some positive things. So one of the positive things is that the federal government wants to lease some public lands to develop into more housing units. They are not going to sell the public lands, which is great, because land in this country, as has been the case since Canada was founded, is the economic driver of everything. So the government is going to maintain their ownership of these lands. They're going to lease lands out to developers, presumably for low costs, so that you can reduce some of the costs in building new units. Now, what is really frustrating in all of this is in all of the details of all of the agreements with all the municipalities or a CMHC or whatever, there's no commitment to taking profit out of housing. Now, that would be very radical, take profit out of all housing, but the federal government, for all of the housing that they have any control over, any funding impact on, the profit in that process should be completely removed. And that's how it was for decades after World War II in Canada, that housing was just built at cost and not to generate a profit. And that's why housing costs were so low. So, we need these kinds of public interventions into the market. And That is nowhere in this budget. There's no conversation about specifically prohibiting profit making in the development of housing. Now, there are some mentions of affordable housing. That's always slippery because who defines affordable? Affordable is defined by usually municipalities, and it's like all over the map for how people define affordable. But the underlying assumption is that Canada's market will correct itself if there's more units flooded into it. That's classical economics. If you studied economics in like fucking high school, you know that like demand is like this and supply is like this, and right in the middle is where your price point is going to be. And so if the housing is expensive in Canada, it's because we don't have enough supply. Housing in Canada is expensive because you can make a lot of money off of it. And it's actually one of the primary drivers of inflation in Canada. So if you imagine that, this strip mall is owned by a REIT, an income trust that has to generate returns for its investors, and your doctor's office is in that strip mall, and the doctor is constantly having to pay higher and higher rent, then they're going to be putting pressure on, regulating bodies, the provinces, or maybe they just have the ability to do this, to charge you more because they're paying higher costs in their strip mall because the strip mall owners are trying to make 5 or 8% returns on investment. This is across the entire economy. Like you can think of it from physiotherapists to the smallest corner stores in Canada. Not to mention, of course, all of the rental housing that is owned by these agencies, which is more than a third in Canada. So there's nothing at all to deal with the key issues in housing that will actually reduce rent. It's all still assuming that the market will correct itself if there's more housing flooded into it. But even the plan to flood the housing isn't that clear. They want to sell off Canada Post offices. I mean, anytime that there's any asset dumps where they want to get rid of assets and they're not going to retain any kind of public ownership, we need to be very, very, very concerned because, again, that tends to just be a wealth transfer from the public to the private for whoever purchases it. And, two of the addresses that I saw that they want to develop in Quebec City are locations that don't make any sense, that are like right beside the Citadel on the Plains of Abraham in the old city. Like you can't make a tower there. That would be illegal. So, I think that it's a lot of wishful thinking, but the Liberals here, what this budget really is trying to control the message on housing and take it away from the Conservatives. And I haven't seen any analysts say this. Maybe those analyses will come out today. But, you have Pierre Poilievre that's like, we need to unlock housing. We need to leverage our assets. We need to sell off our assets to make up more space to unlock housing. A lot of regulatory changes as well that the Conservatives allude to. They don't specifically say what they want to do, but this is their message. It's a lot of high level stuff that doesn't really get into the weeds of what they mean. So one of the constant things, aside from selling off buildings, like, Pierre Poilievre keeps saying that he dreams that someone would live in the CBC building in downtown Toronto because of course he's going to get rid of the CBC. But he also talks about, high densification around transit nodes. That is all in this budget. The Liberals are trying to chip away at the Conservatives' credibility on housing by presenting an actual plan, and a plan that is not so radical that the Conservatives would have a hard time saying that they disagree with doing pretty much, I think, anything that's in this budget. So it's interesting politicking from the Liberals looking at a rising Conservative party to try and kneecap them from being able to do very much on beyond what the Liberals have proposed on housing. Because at the end of the day, the Conservatives are probably a little closer to capital than the Liberals are. No, they're both close to capital. They've got different approaches with how they deal with capital, and neither is going to make the interventions in the market that are actually needed, right? We know that. So that's the housing piece. There's a lot of other things in here that, when you read the budget, you really remember why we used to have beat journalists, beat reporters, the ones that would drill down into the pages that only concern long-term care or that only concern the environment or Indigenous issues, and they can really look at that carefully. Now we've got generalists, they're just like, the federal government's cutting 5,000 public sector workers. Okay, again, not good for the economy, not super good for productivity if you're firing people and they won't have jobs and they won't have salaries and they won't be able to deliver services. But the government promises that in cutting 5,000 civil servants, there won't be any service cuts or service impacts that we're going to experience. I freaking doubt that, but again, we'll see. So, again, we have this government that is trying to look like it's balancing more the tensions between big business and average people. And then they announce, this 5,000 people being laid off from the civil service. And it's like, I don't know, man. Like I'm on hold a lot with CRA. I feel like CRA could use another 5,000 people, just if only for me to not waste my day on the phone with them to figure out my taxes. So a lot of contradictions here, which is of course why the Liberal Party exists. The only other thing that I want to mention is our defense spending. And defense spending in this budget is very, very high. Now, first of all, it's under the heading Protecting Canadians and Defending Democracy. Of course. And they have here a projection of $54.8 billion. Am I reading that right? No, I'm not reading that right. Sorry. When the funding starts to kick into high gear, it's going to be $2.1 billion in 2025. So, huge commitments on to continue our engagements with NATO, aggressively defending the democracy of Ukraine. Obviously, we're obsessed with this. There's a piece in the national defense spending that I think is interesting, which is ending forced labor, and then they only talk about the Uyghurs in China. The Liberals have been very good to politicize this. You'll remember, maybe you don't remember this. There's the Liberals created an ombudsman for corporate responsibility for Canadian entities around the world. The ombudsman's been a total failure. Since 2018, they've only laid one charge. They've only done a couple of investigations, and they're all exclusively looking at regions in China where it's alleged that Uyghurs are being used as forced or slave laborers in different kinds of industries. Now, the most recent charges that they just laid was on a very small mining company where the mining company, which is based in Vancouver, they don't even operate the mines. Like the Chinese government took over their operations in like 2008 or something, but they're still on paper the owners of the mine, but they don't control the mine. And this is the only charge that Canada has laid. If you know anything about mining in this world and the Canadian impact and influence and control over global mining, you will know that there is no shortage of human rights abuses that are happening in Canadian mines. And they might very well be happening in mines in China. But if you look at Mining Watch information, Mining Watch data, Mining Watch being the premier mining criticism activist group in Canada, they're not concerned with mines in China. They're concerned with mines across South America. They're concerned with mines across Africa. They're concerned with mines across North America. And so for this to be in the budget very specifically, continuing to go after forced labor of Uyghurs in China, it just seems like, really obvious massaging a narrative here, because if they're talking about forced labor, then talk about forced labor. If you're talking about China specifically, then talk about China specifically and be honest about where you're accusing China of. Probably won't go well for us, but whatever. Just something that I saw pop out in this budget that I thought was, worth a little mention. But, we've got an affordability crisis. We have a food affordability crisis. We have a crisis of people not being able to have a place over their head. And this budget doesn't do anything really to change anything in any significant way. But no budget is going to do that. And so no one should expect that the budget is going to make these massive changes and then find out that it doesn't. Although if you're a student receiving a SSHRC or an NSERC grant, there is good news. Those amounts are going up for the first time in 10 years. So congratulations to you and to all the professors who have been subsidizing your budgets. I hope they at least have been doing that, because you can't live off of the SSHRC grants as they are. But for the last 40 years, the balance between the wealthy in this country and everybody else has completely become unbalanced, right? Wealth inequality and income inequality has risen sharply in Canada, and the vast majority of people are really, really struggling to get by. Our wages are not keeping up with inflation. We're paying $8 for butter. We're paying $5 for a bag of Ruffles chips. I do that like once a year, but I couldn't believe it when I saw the price a couple of weeks ago. And our government's not doing anything that directly to prohibit this stuff. And I'm going to return to the insufficient funds promise. The government easily can just say, this is going to be how it is. We're going to regulate the cost of rent. We're going to regulate the cost of cell phones. We're going to regulate the cost of apples. And here, we're going to regulate the cost that banks charge you when you are in overdraft. But they're not doing that. They're not going to do that because there's no political pressure on them actually forcing them to do that. All we have are like random speaking points, blah, blah, blah from the NDP that doesn't actually identify the things that really need to be done, because of course the NDP is wrapped up in the system as it is as well. So the budget will go to a vote. The NDP has already an agreement with the Liberals. So regardless of what was in this budget, the NDP is most likely going to vote in favor of it. And it is the kind of budget that is like good enough, there's nothing offensive. I mean, there might be, I've only, spent an hour reading it, so maybe I've missed something, but there's, it's a steady Eddie budget that is trying to identify that the Conservatives have no plan, where the Liberals do have a plan. And where does that leave Canadians? I mean, not really anywhere. It doesn't really, we're going to not see all that much change on the other side of this budget. So there it is. It's a reflection of where we're at. It's not really a projection of where we're going, other than to say every single year where price controls are not introduced, every single year where the market is allowed to make decisions in how it manages itself without the involvement of democratically elected people. I mean, our democratic elected people are not good, which just puts us into this catch-22. Anyway, but it becomes worse and worse and worse. And every amount of the affordability crisis today is because of decisions that were made in previous budgets. And so it'll take a long time for even these decisions to become realized, if they're even realized at all, because we're in a minority government and maybe we'll be in election mode before you know it. I doubt it, because the NDP doesn't want to be. And remember, if the election happens before the end of October 2025, there's a lot of MPs that don't get their pensions. So there's a lot of people who are self-interested to make sure that this government doesn't fall before then.